morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all. Thank you for being here. My name is Shlomi Dinar, and I am the Dean of the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to a new role in Europe, Poland's strategic priorities and challenges, with His Excellency, a friend of the Green School, Marek Magierowski, Poland's ambassador to the United States. Today's program is sponsored by the Blanka Rosenstiel Lecture Series on Poland, a dynamic part of our European and Eurasian Studies program. The event is co-sponsored by the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Democracy, the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series, and the Dorothea Green Lecture Series. We are also very grateful to the American Institute for Polish Culture for their collaboration in making this event possible. This is certainly an opportune moment for us to learn more about Poland's priorities and challenges. It is a country with deep experience of Russian imperialism, and its leaders have been warning their EU partners about the growing threat of Russia for many years. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Poland stepped forward as a leader of Europe's response, providing everything from humanitarian relief to military assistance. The country has absorbed nearly 1 million refugees. Its staunch support for its besieged neighbor Ukraine has thrust Poland into the spotlight and increased its influence in both NATO and the European Union. We have seen how meaningful that is for Ukraine, but what is the impact on Poland? Our speaker today, the ambassador, will share some insights on that subject. Ambassador Marek Magierowski is a former journalist who was deputy head of the economic desk at Gazeta Wyborcza, head of the foreign affairs desk in the business section at Newsweek Polska, and deputy editor-in-chief of Forum and Rzeczpospolita. In 2015, he was appointed head of the press office of the Chancellery of the President. In 2017-2018, he served as Undersecretary of State at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and from 2018 to 2021, he was Poland's ambassador to the State of Israel. And I can tell you, having spoken to him on numerous occasions in Hebrew, his Hebrew language skills are incredible. He's actually debated journalists in Hebrew, so it's incredible. And since 2021, he has served as ambassador to the United States. We're sorry that Lady Blanka Rosenstiel, the honorary consul of Poland in Miami, could not join us today. But we're, of course, continue to be very thankful and grateful for Lady Blanka's support and philanthropic generosity. In fact, Lady Blanka has endowed the lecture series on Poland, which allows us to bring our students, our faculty, and our community compelling program on a variety of topics. As an example, I invite you to visit the Green School Gallery in SIPA 1, that's just across the way, to view The Uncaptive Mind, works from the Polish School of Posters, 1950s through the 1980s, and learn about the remarkable story of freedom these beautiful works reveal. And now, I invite the Honorary Vice Consul, Beata Paszyc, to say a few words.
Good morning. Thank you very much, and welcome to Blanka Rosenstiel Lecture Series on Poland and Ambassador's speech today. As Dean said, she could not be here with us today. However, she would like to welcome you and wish you a very inspiring lecture. And I would like to say that we're extremely honored to once again welcome Ambassador Marek Magierowski. And as you know, every successful man is successful because behind him stands an even more successful and beautiful woman. So on that note, we would like to also welcome Mrs. Anna Magierowski, and Dean will present her with a token of our appreciation and something that we hope will brighten this rainy day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now, without further ado, I want to invite the ambassador to the podium for the lecture.
Thank you so much. Good morning. I have to tell you frankly that the key reason I've come here to Miami again is the possibility to exchange a few words in Hebrew with Shlomi in order for this language not to become too rusty, which is one of the scourges of every linguist and every foreign language speaker, because you forget too fast. And also my heartfelt gratitude for this beautiful Polish weather. At least I feel at home. We don't have as many palm trees as you do here, but still, it's very nice. And this building really smells brand new. I'm a little bit older than this venue. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much to Florida International University and to the American Polish Institute for this kind invitation. Dear friends, in October 1939, just a month after Nazi Germany invaded my country and 2 weeks after the Soviet Union stabbed us in the back, the Gallup Institute here in the United States conducted a survey in which several questions were asked about the American public's attitude towards the war. Let me quote one of those questions. If it appears that Germany is defeating England and France, should the United States declare war on Germany and send our army and navy to fight? The answer was 71% no, 29% yes. Another poll was taken in May 1940 after German tanks rolled into France, Belgium and the Netherlands. The question, do you think the United States should declare war on Germany and send our army and navy abroad to fight? The answer was 93% no, 7% yes. That trend and that mood in America changed after Pearl Harbor. I don't think it is necessary today to send American troops, or Polish for that matter, to defend Ukraine. Direct confrontation with Russia would be unconscionable, to say the least. Nevertheless, history has taught us an important and painful lesson. Inaction, indifference, and complacent isolationism are much costlier than engagement, resolve, and deterrence. We did not stop Hitler in September 1939. We did not contain Stalin in 1945. If we do not stop Putin now, he will return with a vengeance, and the free world will have to pay a hefty price for its ingenuousness. Ladies and gentlemen, like millions of my fellow countrymen, I was blessed to have lived both under communism and democracy. I do not regret it. Before 1989, I experienced command economy, poverty, censorship. After 1989, when we shook off the Soviet nightmare, I enjoyed capitalism, equality, freedom of expression, and I know the difference. And believe me or not, I can now see vestiges of Soviet mentality in contemporary Russia, ruled by a brutal regime. And I presume our Ukrainian brothers do not desire to fall under the same yoke again. Should the United States care about Ukraine? Should Poland, Germany, Britain, France? If we want the Ukrainians to breathe freedom and not radioactive dust, if we want them to enjoy the sound of happiness and not air raid sirens, if we want them to live and not to die, let us not forget that they fight not only for their dignity, but also for ours. And let us not forget that Gallup poll from 1939. Speaking of our common goals in the context of the war in Ukraine, it is imperative to plan for the long term both in NATO and in the European Union. It is useless to gloat over our efforts today as regards military assistance for Ukraine, how many tanks we have provided, how many artillery rounds, how many missiles the Ukrainians have been able to shoot down, how much territory they have recaptured due to our support. There are more crucial questions we should be asking ourselves. How to prepare Ukraine and NATO for the eventuality of another aggression. How to increase our deterrence capabilities and steel our resolve in the face of the unabated Russian neo-imperial brinkmanship. First and foremost, we need to stay committed to our obligations with respect to military spending and modernization of our armed forces. Europe's citizens should feel adequately protected. It is of paramount importance, not only for our mental well-being, but also for budgetary planning and for the needs of our military-industrial complex on both sides of the Atlantic. If we are serious about rebuilding and strengthening it, we must make sure that all interested parties, governments, corporations, and the public opinion know how much we will be spending on defense in 5, 10, or perhaps even 20 years to come. Secondly, we should ask ourselves to what extent we will need Russia also in 5, 10, or perhaps 20 years to come as commercial partner. Is Russia really indispensable for Europe as major supplier of gas, oil, and other commodities? Is Russia an important consumer market for Polish, German, French companies? Is it actually an attractive destination for Italian or Austrian financial institutions? And last but not least, how should we judge businesses still running their operations in Moscow and in St. Petersburg? How should we treat former prominent Western politicians joining boards of Russian oil and gas companies? Thirdly, we should brace ourselves for the upcoming digital revolution and, quite frankly, for the inevitable cutthroat rivalry with China, not separately, not as Europe and the United States, competing or even plotting against each other, but as a collective West, in spite of all tensions and all bickering about artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, semiconductor manufacturing, or privacy regulations. We should prioritize our common interests and values over petty frictions. The war in Ukraine is a test of our unity and cohesion. Ladies and gentlemen, in this respect, there are two countries who have a special role to play in the new geopolitical configuration: the United States and Poland. It is hard to find on the map of contemporary Europe a country or a nation which would be more enthusiastic about the deepening of friendly transatlantic relations than mine. An attitude which, quite obviously, has its roots in recent history. American presence in Europe, both in political and economic dimension, has always been, at least in the view of a vast majority of Poles, a long-lasting guarantee of security and prosperity, from Lisbon to, well, West Berlin. This is what Pax Americana looked like for decades after World War II. We, the peoples on the other side of the Iron Curtain, we never had the opportunity to savor this happiness, bliss, and wealth. Of course, we were aware that not everything west of the Oder River was rosy. Still, we realized how miserable our lives were at the time in comparison with our peers in Paris, London, or Rome. We have always aspired to be as free as the French, as relaxed as the Italians, as self-confident as the British, and as rich as the Germans. But above all, and invariably, we always wanted to be as American as the Americans themselves. Today, according to a survey conducted last June by Pew Research Center, 93% of Poles hold a favorable view of the United States, the most America-loving nation across the world, followed by Israel, 87%, and South Korea, 79%. Actually, I can't remember which place America has taken in that particular ranking. I believe I don't need to tell you which country is at the bottom of this list. It's Russia, of course, with the lowest approval rating amongst my fellow countrymen. No wonder. Interestingly, in Germany and in France, these numbers, as regards America's standing and popularity, are way lower than in Poland, 57 and 52% respectively. It is partly a legacy of the Vietnam War, the anti-nuclear protests of the 80s, American military interventions in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and, last but not least, Soviet influence in opinion-making circles in Western Europe for many years. I don't have empirical data for the following assertion, but I presume that if we asked a moderately educated citizen of a West European country, to whom should we give historical credit for overthrowing communism, the automatic answer would probably be Mikhail Gorbachev. Conversely, a Pole, like me, like my beloved wife, would most likely mention two names, John Paul II and Ronald Reagan. In other words, we must not neglect this particular social background while addressing the perennial question, to what extent should Europe rely on America in terms of its geopolitical and economic future? Should we define this bond as ironclad alliance, indispensable partnership, or marriage of convenience? Secondly, given the above-mentioned discrepancy between Central and Western Europe in regard to the perception of America's role on the international stage, another crucial question arises. How can we render our approach to the US more unified, more coherent, regardless of our level of admiration or suspicion towards America? And there is the third question of fundamental importance for countries like Poland, Czechia, Romania, the Baltics, and many others, more metaphysical than practical. Namely, what is Europe in the eyes of the American political and business elites? Where does it begin and where does it end? My impression is that the Iron Curtain still exists in the mentality of many decision makers, historians, journalists, pundits on this side of the pond. And also millions of ordinary citizens. Again, if you asked a moderately educated American taxpayer if he or she has ever been to Europe and what their memories are of that journey, the first association that would come to their minds would be Venice and not Krakow. It would be Notre Dame and not St. Stephen's Basilica in Budapest. It would be the Buckingham Palace, not the Royal Castle in Prague. At first sight, it is a fairly academic debate, but in my opinion, it is tremendously relevant to the future of the transatlantic relationship. As long as we don't bridge this mental gap between Western and Central or Eastern Europe, we will never speak with one voice as a political collective, and our interests will never be the same. I will give you two telling examples of distinct differences which are somehow intertwined. First, energy policy. In spite of our countless and recurrent warnings about the danger of over-dependence on Russian gas and oil, some of our partners in the European Union, I'm not going to name names because I'm a diplomat, did develop an ominous addiction to Russian raw materials. For decades, common European policy in this sphere was virtually impossible. Consequently, it was sterile and useless to even talk about, quote, Europe's energy policy, unquote, because there was no such thing. Second, for many years, the transportation system in Central and Eastern Europe lagged behind the highways, the railways, the seaports, terminals, pipeline networks in the West. Even after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, it was more reasonable and profitable to invest in infrastructure along the west-east axis and not north-south. Now, in the framework of the so-called 3 Cs initiative, we are striving to make up for this long-standing neglect, rankling some of our neighbors who erroneously assume that we are trying to drive a wedge between West and East and create a parallel political structure within the European Union. Again, how should we, in this context, define the common European infrastructural policy? Make no mistake, we are not without blemish. We are still learning the mechanics of the European institutions. Occasionally, we are not solicitous enough about the sensitivities and the legitimate concerns of our Western friends. We do not fully understand each other because of history, our cultural roots, and our approach to EU-US relations. John Paul II once famously said, "The Christian church needs 2 lungs, the Eastern and the Western one." We may apply the same principle to Europe as political entity. In all likelihood, the East and the West will never become 1 lung. Perhaps it is even healthier. The question is how we can make these 2 lungs breathe in unison. Distinguished guests, I will permit myself now to talk briefly about Poland's foreign policy priorities, just to give you some food for thought before the less official part of this event. Priority number 1, sustaining Ukraine's military effort in the face of the Russian aggression. The situation on the ground is increasingly volatile and unpredictable. Apparently, both warring parties have reached a stalemate. We are facing a race against time, with the Russians mobilizing more conscripts and regrouping along the front lines, and the Ukrainians awaiting more advanced weaponry to contain the Russian advances. Russian troops, still insufficiently trained and poorly equipped, nevertheless, a sheer human mass to be reckoned with. Priority number 2, implementing the conclusions of the recent NATO summit in Vilnius. Key word, deterrence. Russia still feels emboldened, not only to continue its unprovoked offensive in Ukraine, but also to threaten NATO countries, like Poland, oftentimes playing the nuclear card. Increasing and reinforcing NATO's physical presence on the eastern flank and effectively deterring Russia should be NATO's chief task in the years to come. Priority number 3, putting Belarus back in the spotlight. Alexander Lukashenko's ever-tightening alliance with Putin's Russia and reprisals against the democratic opposition have been somewhat overlooked by the international community. It's not only about the abhorrent nature of this regime, but also about its complicity in war crimes committed in Ukraine. Priority number 4, countering the Russian disinformation worldwide. If you think that we are winning the battle of narratives, you are terribly wrong. The Kremlin's rhetoric regarding the war in Ukraine and its origins falls on fertile ground in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, for a host of reasons. The anti-American, or more broadly, anti-Western resentment being one of them. Moreover, at the peak of the Cold War, and shortly afterwards, tens of thousands of young people from countries affiliated with the Soviet bloc, we would define them today as Global South, received scholarships and studied in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, and in other Soviet and Russian cities. Now, those people, mostly in their 60s or 70s, many of them are heads of state, prime ministers, foreign ministers, ambassadors, lawyers, journalists, celebrities, in those countries, in Africa, in Latin America, and in Asia. They speak Russian, at least a vast majority of them. They are constantly exposed to Russian propaganda. There are the assets that Kremlin uses brazenly and with stunning efficiency to pursue its own agenda. Priority number 5, striking the right balance in our relationship with China. Of course, we have no doubts whatsoever about the true nature of the Chinese communist regime. Also because we know very well what communism means in all its aspects. However, it is of critical importance for us to maintain channels of communication and to advance cooperation with Beijing, predominantly in the economic sphere. By the way, Xi Jinping has just landed in San Francisco, my understanding is. Priority number 6, the last one, upholding Poland's status as an economic rising star. We are invariably upbeat about our country's unique character as a technological and logistical hub in Central Europe. Attracting foreign investments has always been and will remain the utmost priority of all governments, regardless of political colors, and I'm saying this deliberately just 2 weeks after the parliamentary elections in Poland. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your kind attention.
We invite folks to ask any questions. So if there are questions, please, of the ambassador. Please, just raise your hand so we know who you are.
I was going to ask about Lukashenko.
Okay.
Brought him up. What do you think is a possibility that, considering Russia's economic downturn currently as we speak, considering how much Belarus relies on Russia, what do you think is a possibility that in a decade from now you'll see the fall of that regime and the immigrants that will come out from that poor country and going to like the Baltics, Poland, for example?
I expect the fall of all those regimes in our immediate vicinity, because of course both Russia and Belarus have always been our neighbors, and this particular geographical and political situation will never change. So those countries and those nations will never vanish from our horizon. So we cannot move the Russians further to Siberia, and the Russians cannot move us further to Berlin or Paris or Florida. That wouldn't be such a bad idea, by the way. But seriously, I think it's a question of time, it's a question of our patience, and it's also a question, and I think it's mostly a question of our continuous, relentless pressure on those countries and on all those ruthless regimes in our neighborhood in Central Europe. Lukashenko is rightly defined and described as the last European dictator. We live in the 21st century, so it's about time to get rid of this kind of dictatorships. I think economic sanctions, there are 2 facets of any kind of economic punitive measures. They are effective, but they work very slow. So we have to arm ourselves with patience. I believe the sanctions in various areas and in various sectors have yet to kick in. The Russian economy and more broadly the Russian society have not yet felt the pinch of these hardships. We are receiving signals that the situation about the downturn that you have just mentioned, about the difficulties some industries in Russia are experiencing, but I think we are still in the initial stages of this process. The question is how resilient we are, because we already know that the Russian economy is tremendously resilient. I used to joke in conversations also with my American interlocutors that with all due respect, but Russians can survive on cabbage and potatoes. Partly like us. I mean, this is the Slavic nature and the Slavic psyche. We can also survive on cabbage and potatoes. So they are very resilient. They have somehow shifted their economy to wartime procedures, if you will. So it will take time to see the Russian economy collapse entirely. Now, my bold assertion and prediction is that we should wait for a major economic crisis in China to see Russia suffering seriously. Because if China enters into a tailspin of economic hardships, again, in manifold areas, that would mean, for example, a dramatic slump in prices of raw materials, which would directly and automatically dent the Russian budget and hit the Russian economy in its entirety. So again, after the invasion of Georgia in 2008, and then after the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, both the United States and the European Union did impose sanctions on Russia, and some of them truly severe. But then we began to lift them in stages because we wanted to return to business as usual with our Russian partners, because, as I said in my initial remarks, we had always been, not Poland, fortunately, but many of our European partners in the European Union had been so profoundly addicted to Russian gas and to Russian oil. Now the situation has changed significantly. For a year, almost exactly to this day, for a year, Poland has been entirely independent on imports of Russian gas. We have reduced our reliance on Russian commodities to zero. We inaugurated, in October last year, we inaugurated the so-called Baltic Pipe, which now transfers gas from the Norwegian continental shelf via Denmark to the Polish stretch of the Baltic coast. We are importing tons of LNG, the liquefied natural gas, mostly from American companies, but also from some partners in the Middle East. So we have actually achieved energy independence and energy security. And we have always been prescient about this prospect and about this very likely scenario of Mr. Putin using energy as a weapon. And he finally, at the peak of this ongoing war in Ukraine, he did weaponize energy, but it was already too late for him, because many countries in Europe had understood how dangerous and how ominous it was for them to get too addicted to Russian commodities. So, and again, there were, to your point about Lukashenko, in the past there were attempts to appease him, to placate him, to drag him almost physically to the Western world, and to convince him that he should decouple himself as a political leader, but also his own country, from Russia in both political and economic terms. It is difficult because, as I said, Belarus is so dependent, mostly economically, on Russia, as are many other post-Soviet republics, especially in the Russian underbelly in Central Asia. Now we are seeing some very mild developments in those countries, like Kazakhstan, for example. I will give you one interesting and hilarious example of what happened 3 days ago during a summit attended by some Russian officials. I think the Russian foreign minister was there in the Kazakh capital, and the Kazakh president began his opening remarks speaking in Kazakh, which was the very first time in the history of those bilateral summits between Kazakhstan and Russia. And all members of the Russian delegation a little bit nervous because they were looking for their earbuds in order to understand what the Kazakh president had to say, because he did not speak Russian for the first time in the history of those contacts. So it's again, it's funny. It's well, at first sight, it's completely irrelevant. It's just a detail of diplomacy, but in my view, it's extremely important. So these little details, these little elements in this particular puzzle are very important. So I'm not saying that there is now a brewing rebellion in all those post-Soviet republics south of Russia, but I think that something has already started there, which will have very nasty consequences for Russia as a post-Soviet empire. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for coming to Florida and sharing your wisdom with us. My question has to do with the strategy of Poland in the military and its relationship with the U.S. military. Do you see further cooperation and advancements in terms of the U.S. supporting Poland, such as setting up a base in Poland?
No. The military cooperation between the U.S. and Poland is thriving right now, and whenever I used that joke yesterday, so I'm very sorry for repeating it, but whenever my defense minister descends up in Washington and meets with his counterparts at the DoD or with the defense contractors, he always comes with a wallet that thick. We are in a buying spree right now, purchasing a lot of American military equipment from American defense contractors. There have been a dozen contracts signed over the last couple of months. We have just bought 250 Abrams tanks, 32 F-35s. So we are going to have one of the strongest, one of the most modern fleet of combat aircraft in Europe. As I said, deterrence is of fundamental importance for us. It doesn't mean that we don't believe that the famous Article 5 of the Washington Treaty will never work, because you know what's enshrined in that particular article. We expect, and all NATO members expect, other members to come to their rescue if need be, if there is a major conflagration, for example, in our part of Europe and Russia chooses to invade Poland or the Baltics. So this is how this Article 5 could be triggered. It doesn't mean that we don't believe in the sacrosanct character of this particular provision. It means that we want to lead by example. We want to be the beacon for other countries in Europe, mostly in Europe, which are somehow lagging behind in terms of their military spending. We are going to reach 4% of our GDP next year in terms of military expenditures. So when you compare this figure to other countries in Europe, again, I'm not going to name names, it is unprecedented. There are unfortunately just a few countries in Europe, Poland included, which do spend enough money on the military in order to be capable of deterring Russia. So I don't think we are going to deviate from this path. We are going to keep spending a lot of money on the military. This is what we are obliged to do, actually, being a country squeezed between Russia and Germany, which is our partner and ally now, both in the European Union and in NATO. But given our bilateral history with both Russia and Germany, you have to understand this is a not very comfortable geographical position for us. So we need to be strong militarily, and I believe that there will be many more contracts and much more cooperation between the Polish government, again, no matter who rules in Warsaw and who rules in Washington, who sits in the Oval Office, we'll see. The defense cooperation is one of the pillars of our bilateral bond with America.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. My question is regarding your position and what it's like for you on a daily basis dealing with the ongoing conflict in Russia and Ukraine.
We are supporting Ukraine unwaveringly. We are still delivering weapons, maybe not so pompously and not in the open, but there are some processes that even I can't talk about, But, well, on a more serious note, we have supplied Ukraine with more than 350 tanks. Main battle tanks, since the beginning of the war, which was one of the largest contributions with regard to the aid provided by all European countries. I didn't mention, because I have already spoken so frequently about our humanitarian assistance for Ukraine. Shlomi just said that about 1 million, it's even more. It's about 1.5 million Ukrainian refugees who have found safe shelter in Poland since February 24th, 2022. Now, if you combine this figure with also approximately 1.5 million Ukrainian economic migrants who had lived and worked in Poland even before the war, so you have that about 3 million Ukrainians living in Poland. It's about 8% of our population, and this changes completely some demographic trends in Poland. We used to be, before World War II, Poland used to be a very diverse society and a very diverse country with Jews, Belarusians, Russians, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Germans living on Polish soil. Relatively in peace, not always, but relatively in peace. There was coexistence. After World War II, that changed, and we became much more unified and much more homogeneous in terms of race, in terms of language, in terms of societal setup of our nation. And now it is changing. And it is interesting to see how smoothly a vast majority of the Ukrainian immigration integrates into the Polish society. They learn the language in a matter of months. And I'm talking mostly about children who, as you know, learn the language much faster than we do. Many of, almost about 95% of those refugees are women and children, because we all know what the Ukrainian men are doing right now. So when they arrive in Poland, they never say, I want an allowance. I want the Polish authorities to take care of myself and of my family. They never say, I want welfare. They always say, I want a job. I want a job. And they get jobs. Because fortunately, the unemployment rate in Poland is ridiculously low. It's about between 3 and 4%. It's the lowest by far in the European Union. So there are two elements which have converged: low unemployment rate and a wave of mass migration from forced migration, actually, from Ukraine. But we are dealing with this problem pretty, I'm not saying that flawlessly, but pretty well. With the engagement and involvement of state authorities, NGOs, ordinary citizens, and I think that this trend will not change. Many of those Ukrainian immigrants and refugees have already re-emigrated to other countries. But still, as I said, 1.5 million, roughly, have stayed in Poland, and they've chosen our country as their new homeland. So they are most welcome, and I believe that this trend will not change so far. And then there are always frictions and tensions when you talk about migration in Europe more broadly. We now can see, for example, the problems many European governments have to tackle with, like those protests against the war in the Gaza Strip, organized and held by thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Muslims who live in those European countries. There is a tiny minority of Muslims too in Poland, about 60,000 people. But those Muslims immigrated to Poland in the 16th century. So again, they are perfectly integrated. They practice their religion, they practice their customs, but they are Polish. They are Muslims, but they are Polish. So their chief identity is Polish. So this is that distinct difference between the Muslim migration we have in Poland and all those migrants from Arab and Muslim countries that have lived for decades, for generations, in countries like France, Austria, Germany, and so on. So, to your point about Poland's engagement and assistance, I think that sudden reaction and that outburst of solidarity and sympathy towards Ukrainians just after the beginning of the war had one underlying cause, namely we also know what Russian aggression and what Russian occupation means. So the Poles reacted so vehemently to what happened in Irpin, in Bucha, in Mariupol, because we recalled all those images from the past when Poles were massacred and slaughtered, when Poles were deported to Siberia, when Poles had to live under brutal Russian and Soviet occupation. So we share our common past, we share history, and we share, it's not hatred, but it's, it's aversion, animosity. Again, Russia has always been, is, and will remain our neighbor. I love the Russian literature. I love the Russian music. I speak Russian haltingly, but I read Russian. I know the Cyrillic, and it's really painful for me to think about Russia as a country which is ruled by this vampire, Mr. Putin. They had not deserved this. They had not deserved this. But on the other hand, you have to remember that we are talking about more than Putin came to power in the year 2000, right? So it's been 23 years of brainwashing and indoctrination. From the very beginning of Putin's first term as president, he and the closest circle of his aides and his acolytes have been convincing the Russian public, the Russian society, that Russia had always been and still is encircled by NATO countries, by America. Poland is now a major threat to, existential even, to Russia, which is, of course, completely preposterous, absurd. But this is one of the arguments Mr. Putin and Mr. Medvedev, the former president and the former prime minister, are using on a daily basis. So, and this, when you, I don't know how many people now in Russia genuinely endorse this special military operation in Ukraine, as they call it. But I believe that their view of the outer world is utterly distorted. Not only because of that operation, which has lasted for the last 3 years, a PSYOP, but also because they have been somehow isolated from what we consume in our media. So they have, many of them have not even been exposed to free independent media for many years. We can be, complaining about the quality of the media nowadays. In America, in France, in Poland, we can be complaining about our children and our grandchildren. I don't have grandchildren, but, well, hypothetically, being, glued to screens and using TikTok almost incessantly. But it's much better because they have no constraints. They can consume the media as they wish. We just have to direct them somehow, if we want to. Many parents don't, but we do care about what news and what kind of information our kids get. In Russia, it's even impossible because they live in a bubble, and they cannot even prick it in order to get out and in order to get exposed to independent media and independent news. So that's the problem. But again, referring to your question, it will take plenty of time to change this.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, Poland held parliamentary elections a few weeks ago, and we know there is a possibility that the opposition consolidates a coalition and forms a new government led by Donald Tusk. How do you think this will change Poland's relationship with the United States, Russia, NATO, and the EU?
There will be some changes, of course, because there is a tendency, and not only in Poland but across the world, that once the new government installs itself, the new prime minister or the new president wants to demonstrate that he is different. So it's one of the reasons why some decisions are implemented so quickly and so sometimes so ostentatiously, in order to prove, like this is what Obama did after Bush, this is what Trump did after Obama, and this is what Biden did after Trump, and this is what Trump will probably do after Biden, to demonstrate that we are going to change our policies and our politics. So I do believe that once Mr. Tusk is assigned the task to cobble together a new coalition, he will try to introduce some alterations, if you will, into Poland's foreign policy. But I don't expect many major shifts, especially in our relationship with Russia or the United States. Also because there is widespread consensus in the Polish societies, so you cannot run your agenda counter to the wishes and to the needs of a wider society. And this is what even the electorate of the current opposition expects from him, not to change too many things. There was a poll, by the way, taken a few days ago, in which Poles were asked about some infrastructural investments, which the current government of Law and Justice began many years ago. And in spite of the fact that there will be change of government and the opposition won the elections, a critical majority of Poles expect the new government to continue those infrastructure projects. So they want someone else to do exactly the same as the current government or the former government has been doing for years. So do not expect, there is a lot of talking, as usual, in the campaign, but electoral campaigns differ greatly from political reality once you are in place as a new prime minister. Okay? I need more women.
La Russie et le Germanie vous attaquent.
Podemos también hablar en español si quieres.
Oh my God, en serio. Oh my God, ¿de verdad?
No, si le es más fácil.
Bueno, yo adelante, señor, yo también.
No, usted adelante. Continúe.
Me conduele mucho.
I will just try to translate very briefly what the lady said, that she's very worried about Poland's history, and she remembers that she has a friend whose grandfather, right, his grandmother is Polish. Okay. And whenever they talk about Poland's history, they almost cry because it's so sad and so complicated, so convoluted. And she says that she's also very worried about the situation in Israel, and she wanted to know my opinion about it, which is quite obvious because I used to be the Polish ambassador to Israel. But again, I cannot be very objective, unfortunately, because as former Polish ambassador to Israel, as you can imagine, I have so many friends there, and since October the 7th, I've been receiving messages and pictures and links from dozens of my friends whom I left in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem and in Haifa and in many other places in Israel. So I'm biased. I'm biased, and I know I realize the scale of suffering today among the Israeli public and among my friends. On the other hand, I also I'm acutely aware that this is in my view, an unstoppable spiral of violence. And quite paradoxically, when you talk about the roots of this conflict, a long-lasting one, it's not about a two-state solution. It's not about all those agreements which were signed in the past. It's predominantly about land. It's about land. We are talking about a very small territory in which two big nations have been competing for land for so many years. Many, many years before the establishment of the State of Israel in People, entire families, Jews and Arabs, expelled from their homes, expelled from their land, losing property, automatically, without compensation, without reparations, without, it's very difficult even for us to imagine how tense the situation there is. Whenever we talked mostly with our Arab friends, they were always mentioning land, and they were saying the Jews robbed us, the Jews stole our land. Even those Arabs, I'm still talking about those who were our acquaintances, maybe not friends, at least not all of them, but they were always mentioning land. And Israelis, on the other side, they were saying, we have, every Israeli family, every Jewish family in Israel has lost someone in their family because of a terrorist attack, staged by Hamas, by Hezbollah, by lone wolves in Tel Aviv, in the immediate vicinity of the Gaza Strip, and so on and so forth. So when you take into account these grievances, at first sight it seems absolutely unsolvable. And I know something about Israel's history. I know something about this particular land's history also, because for us it's a holy land. So it has an additional significance for us Poles as Catholics. But don't expect me to come up with an automatic solution to this conflict. Again, it will take time. Again, we'll have to arm ourselves with patience. It will take generations. Now we are witnessing that ground offensive of Israeli troops in the Gaza Strip, and the question is, of course, we have to do our utmost in order to avoid more bloodshed, to avoid more casualties on both sides. On the other hand, I'm going to say something maybe controversial, but I do understand the Israeli government's decision to send ground troops to the Gaza Strip, because the Gaza Strip has been ruled by Hamas officially, not as a terrorist organization, but as a political entity, for how many, 2006?
2005.
2005, yes, when Ariel Sharon decided to withdraw Israeli settlements from the Gaza Strip. So it's been 18 years of misery. In spite of the fact that Hamas had been elected apparently democratically in elections, and Hamas was assigned the task of ruling the Gaza Strip. But they haven't done very admirably. They haven't. Now the question is what Israel will do next. If the Israeli troops will remain in the Gaza Strip, if we will witness a full-scale occupation of the Gaza Strip, if the Israeli government will attempt to administer and to rule the Gaza Strip for the sake of the Gaza Strip's citizens, or they will finally withdraw, leaving a void behind them. I think this is the crucial question and the vital dilemma the Israeli government is facing right now, what to do with the Gaza Strip after Hamas is defeated, because I think that with this, with this raw military force, Israel is absolutely capable of defeating Hamas. But defeating Hamas is only the first step. And the second step should be to come up with a relatively reasonable proposal what to do with the Gaza Strip and what to do with the citizens of Arab descent in that area.
We have time for one more question, which we'll go from. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Just related to the military again, do you think Poland would consider reinstating mandatory military service? Just for days? And if not, since the war started,
you should ask my son what he thinks about that.
Has the military been able to attract as many volunteers? Has that amount increased or decreased? Or?
There is are a solution somewhere in the middle of these two concepts, voluntary and obligatory mandatory military service. As you know, Israel does have mandatory military service. We cancelled it many years ago, I think just after the transition in 1989. And there is, of course, an ongoing debate in the face of what is going on in Ukraine and in light of Russia's growing aggressiveness, whether we should re-establish obligatory military service. But it's also a very toxic political decision. And as you know, electoral, especially over the last couple of years, in all European countries, electoral campaigns are ceaseless. They never end. So once you announce that it is your intention to reinstate obligatory military service in Poland, you are done politically. Because too much time has elapsed since the cancellation of the military service in Poland, in order for all those young people in the 70s, 80s, and in the beginning of the 20s to accept such a proposal. So the political backlash would be tremendous. So I don't believe that any Polish politician would be stupid enough to come up with such a proposal. Although, as I said, there is a solution which was implemented a few years ago, namely the establishment of the so-called territorial defense, which is between obligatory military service and voluntary. So there are about 60,000 people who have enlisted in this territorial defense. This is not a regular army, but they are equipped, they are trained, and they are like reservists. So they can be mobilized in a matter of days, actually, if need be. So I think that we will continue on this path rather than reinstating obligatory military service.
Last one.
Okay.
Very last.
The very last one. Could you, Mr. Ambassador, say a few words, and I know it's a huge topic, about the reparations for Poland from Germany?
Yes, it's a huge topic and a very controversial one and very ticklish, because, as you know, a year and a half ago, the Polish government extended a note, an official diplomatic note to the German government, asking about the possibility of paying war reparations to Poland, which have never been doled out to Polish citizens. There have been some payments made to people, Polish citizens, who suffered forced labor in Germany during the war, not the Jewish, people of non-Jewish descent. But it was a trifling amount of money, and Germany has always refused, since the end of the World War II, to pay war reparations to Poland, which is a historical and moral failure of subsequent German governments. So this topic has always been in the front and center of our bilateral relationship with Germany. Now, to your point about changes in the foreign policy run by the new Polish government, I think that the Polish government will not be so eager to reopen negotiations with Berlin about war reparations. They would, I believe, prefer to calm the waters a little bit, because actually the entire debate about war reparations has somehow strained our relations with Germany, but it's still an unsolved issue which should be solved. Because I will give you a parallel example. After we joined the European Union, we opened up our market, our labor market. We invited investments and investors also from Germany, and thousands of German companies came to Poland and invested in Poland, and they employed people, and they benefited largely from Poland's membership in the European Union. And this is one of those distorted arguments that I hear so frequently about Poland's about what Poland and how Poland has benefited from being a member of the European Union. I always say this is Germany and France and Italy and Austria and Britain and the British and the German and the French companies which have benefited much more from Poland being a member of the European Union than we did being a member of the European Union. So you can not even imagine the profits that, for example, German companies have made after 2004, after Poland's accession to the European Union. So this is an imbalance, if you will, between what we expect from Germany with regard to our political relationship and what we and how Germany and how Poland have benefited from our relationship inside the European Union. You know, when you look at Europe's map and you see all those tendencies, for example, the debate about the colonial past and all those grievances which have accumulated over the last, not decades, but over the last hundreds of years, after colonization by the British, by the French, by the Italians to some extent, mostly in Africa, those debates have not ended either, about compensation, about reparations, about the suffering of countries like Namibia, like Cameroon, like Senegal, about slavery. There was a movement also in the United States of black people who demand compensation for the unimaginable suffering in the 19th century and also in the 20th century here in America. So it is virtually impossible to erase the past, to erase those feelings and those grievances, and the same principle applies also to Polish-German relations. Last one, and a very brief one.
No, it's a statement. I was
okay.
In my opinion, I don't think reparations are ever going to truly work. I look at Japan and South Korea. Japan, what matters...
But it's still vivid, right?
Yeah,
it's still vivid.
It's still very tough. I think what matters is just mostly how good economic and political relations are.
Last one.
Yeah.
The very last one.
So, what has been the biggest achievement of the U.S.-Poland relationship?
Strengthening of the military cooperation, I think. You mentioned the military presence in Poland. We have always insisted on the necessity of having a permanent presence of U.S. or NATO troops, for that matter, in Poland. Now we have, I think, for a year, the headquarters of the 5th Corps in Poznan, in which we both studied, our city, of the American 5th Corps. So we are progressing. We need more American troops. We need more American presence. We are talking about nuclear sharing. We are talking about more permanent bases of U.S. troops on Polish soil. And we have chosen and we have decided consciously and deliberately to purchase more American military equipment, more American weaponry, because we're to believe that this is America has always been and will remain our most steadfast ally. And that's why we are trying to strengthen our military cooperation mostly with America, also for some logistical and technical reasons. It's much easier to, for example, to service the Abrams tanks if all of them are American. And we could have, of course, 250 American tanks, 50 German tanks, and 75 French tanks. But logistically, it would be much more difficult and much less reasonable to have this variety of hardware in our army. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, Anna, for being here, for your comments, for answering questions. In addition to seeing members from the community, I'm also seeing not only school leadership, but also university leadership here. And I also want to thank the students for being here. I'd like to thank Professor Araras, Professor Pedroso. I know you brought your students to this conversation, so thank you. And the last thing I'll say is, and I mentioned this in my earlier opening remarks, the exhibition, An Uncaptive Mind. That exhibition opens today, this evening at 6:30. Please, we'd love to see you, so please join us at 6:30 this evening at the gallery, of the SIPA 1 building. And with that, thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yeah, no, the service here is terrible. My aunt was out there waiting for me, and like now I'm going to explain to her.
Half